being a chemistry professor, I'm always worried. I'm always thinking backwards. Most people call it thinking analytically. I want to think backwards. So I want to think about what the end goal is and then work my process backwards with the skills, resources, and knowledge I have at the time. So if someone has $100,000, they want to invest, passively in whatever distinction they consider passive, then that's usually my next question is, well, what's the end goal? Is this just something you want to try because you want an extra $1,000 a month? Or is this something that you potentially want to transition from being an active investor to a private lender or a passive investor at some point in the future? And this is your route to learn the ropes. Those are two very different tracks.
Welcome to the Real Estate Mindset Podcast, hosted by Eric Nelson and brought to you by Wild Oak Capital. Eric is a real estate investor, business owner, and performance coach. Throughout this series, Eric explores the mindset behind why certain investors are so successful and how we can learn from their achievements and failures. Eric asks the tough questions around the habits, discipline, mindset, and more required to achieve the most ambitious goals. Thank you for being here and enjoy the show.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Real Estate Mindset Podcast. This is your host, Eric Nelson. And tonight I'm super excited. It's something a little different, a guest who has a different strategy. So I'm jazzed to talk to her. This is Alex Breshears. Alex, thanks for being on.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So what I always do is the standard podcast thing. If you could, give us your background, a little bit of your story, and then how you came to real estate. And then we'll dive into obviously kind of your strategies and we'll get pretty deep there. But if you could just give us a background.
Of course. So like many others, I've always kind of been intrigued by having some sort of income outside of just my normal W-2 job. And that was something that was kind of always brought into our household by my parents younger in life. When I got married, I married the military, and unbeknownst to me, that's going to drastically change the trajectory of my life because my parents lived in the same area for, 35 years. So it was never really a thought that, hey, you can't do something because you're continuously going to be moving until we got into that situation where we were continuously moving. So like I mentioned earlier, I'm sitting in my 19th address in 20 years. It's been a wild ride. We've been bounced all over the United States and internationally once. And it's just been something that, you just kind of have to roll with the punches. And one of the things that we kind of had to roll with is we were still adamant about finding a way to invest in real estate. We believed in the power of investing in real estate, but being an active, what most people would quote unquote consider an active investor, which is, if you're going to be a fix and flipper like they do on HGTV, or you're going to be a landlord, didn't really fit our lifestyle. And we also found out later after attempting both of those that they did not fit our goals or our personalities or our skill set. So, kind of in the grand scheme of things, we took a beat and we were like, okay, let's find something that actually works for us. Not that those other methods of investing are necessarily or inherently bad. They work great for a whole lot of people, but they don't work for us because of our unique lifestyle and the requirements we have on us. And then years and years before, about 20 years ago, I actually went to a RIA meeting and I just happened to run into someone there that was a hard money lender or a private lender, looking back on it, more private lender than hard money lender. And he asked, if I would be interested in doing some sort of loan originator position, loan broker type of position. And he's like, you could work your own hours. It's basically flexible. And I'm like, I was in undergrad at the time. And I'm like, sure, let's do that. We'll give that a try. You're young, you're dumb, figure it out, And this was back before, there weren't smartphones. There were barely phones, mobile phones, but they were smart, they definitely weren't smart. And, fax machines were still a thing for anybody old enough to remember what a fax machine is. And a lot of times I was running to these properties to actually get the application filled out. I was walking the property to see what their scope of work looked like. I was actually able to drive by the comps, that they were providing, saying, yeah, this one, suits up with the one I'm currently trying to rehab. And it was a very hands-on way to learn investing but I also got the added benefit of seeing investing from the other side because I also worked in that broker's office. Back when people actually had to write paper checks and then you had to get in your car and drive them to the bank. I was the person doing a lot of that back office work as well. And just something always struck me really interesting. They would come in, the investors would come in to pay their payments, every month, the interest only payments. And of course, they do a little bit of belly aching, hey, the tenant moved in and paid first and last and hasn't paid since. Okay, well, you still got to pay the mortgage. Sorry. And then, they'll come in and say that the contractor ran off with, half the deposit I gave him for supplies. And now I got to find another one. And now I'm out $10,000. It's like, well, sorry, you still got to pay the mortgage. And it was just kind of a funny thing to see that no matter what went wrong, it was realistically like you always have to pay the mortgage. And I was routinely seeing this person, deposit checks anywhere between $700 and $2,700 a month, from these investors. And he's not getting calls at 2 a.m. that the hot water heater broke. He's not having to find backup contractors upon backup contractors and pick out tile and all these other things. He's on the golf course 75% of the time. This was in Florida. So, I was like, there might be something to this whole lending thing.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, cool. Well, I mean, that's such a cool background. So if you could keep going, I mean, where are you now? What are you doing? I mean, it sounds like you found what we're leading the show into, of course, is lending. But could you tell us like how, continue the story if you don't mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So, throughout lots of our moves, most military spouses tend to be overeducated and underemployed or unemployed. I was no exception to that for many years. I am actually a chemistry professor by trade. I actually teach online. I taught online before it was cool, thanks to COVID. And so that allowed me some geographical freedom as far as like being able to have a W-2 income. But when COVID kind of shut the world down here in Virginia in about mid-March of last year, it really became apparent like, okay, the world is changing. We need to do something to change with it. We had been stationed here for about a year. I had made some contacts, other active duty service members in the area that were also investing in real estate. And, Zoom was a brand new thing. And I happened to be in a local virtual networking event in a Zoom meeting very early on in COVID and just happened to get put in a breakout room, with some other people that were local in the area. And they were talking about the impacts that COVID was having on their business, even so early on. And I happened to be in a room with a gentleman that said, he was supposed to be closing on a property in a week. And now he's not going to be able to do it because the hard money loan broker told, they're just shutting their doors. He had no forewarning and he's called multiple since then and nobody's lending, it's just basically dried up entirely. So now he's going to lose out on this deal locally because of all of this going on. I was like, well, tell me about the deal. And he says, okay, it's this. And where's it located? He tells me where it's located. And I was like, hey, here's my number. Let's connect offline. I'd like to learn more about this. I might be able to fund this deal if you can give me a little bit of time to kind of get everything together. And it was just kind of funny. It just kind of worked out that way. But, talk to him. He's another active duty service member. He's in the Navy. It turned out to be the exact type of property we would be willing to lend on. It turned out to be the exact type of borrower we'd want to work with. And then off to the races we were. We kind of started getting, things in line to do this as like an actual business, as opposed to us just handing money over to some stranger over the internet, make sure what the process was, get everything documented. And within about a week and a half, we had funded our first loan and we were kind of off to the races. And because those hard money lenders, basically pulled back with no forewarning, we actually had a year where we just had constant demand until they basically opened back up. And even now they're not quite to kind of pre-COVID lending standards. So they're still much higher as far as what they're looking for in underwriting terms. And that's true even on the conventional loan side. So it's been a very fun, interesting year of, making relationships with people and seeing how you can help. And it just works out to be more of a win-win situation.
Yeah. I mean, okay, first of all, there's just so much to unpack with what you just said. So thanks for sharing. I like to start with saying thanks to you and your spouse for, you have to say thanks for your sacrifice. I mean, you guys have been bouncing around and holy cow, and just thanks for your service. So that is first and foremost for sure. And that's more important than this podcast even. So I have to say that without question. And then, there's just so much to dive into here. So help me understand, first of all, I just say, help the listeners understand regulations behind this. And I understand, some states are going to be different, obviously, and usury laws are going to be talk to your attorney, kind of the standard thing we say. But if you could, I mean, let's say there's a listener out there who says, yeah, I've got 100K and this lending thing sounds pretty sweet. There's lots of ways to do it, but can you kind of unpack that a little bit, at least top level? How do you get involved and what does it look like?
Sure. So as a private lender, you're essentially operating, for lack of a better term, as the bank. So you are going to be funding the loan. And with that responsibility comes also underwriting the loan. And people might not necessarily understand what underwriting means, but underwriting is essentially a process of looking for a reason to say no. Is this borrower not qualified? Do they not have enough assets? Is the scope of work too big? Is the scope of work too small? Do they not have a good business plan? They want to retail sale the property, but it's in a C- neighborhood that's a strong rental market. It's one of those things. So you're having to put together all these pieces to go, yeah, I'm comfortable with this. And that's basically what underwriting is. And if you're not comfortable with it, then you're not doing the loan. But realistically, a lot of it is done by third parties. So for example, they're going to get, I require lender's title insurance. Well, that's going to be done at a title company. So the property's not going to close unless it has clear title. There's some nuances within title, but for the most part, you're going to have clear title when you go to close. So that's taken care of for you as a lender. Insurance, they have to talk to their insurance broker and just making sure that you understand what type of coverage they have. Is it adequate? And then pretty much, again, that's taken care of by someone else. You can hire an attorney to draw up your documentation, a mortgage, a deed of trust. Just let them know what the terms are that you're wanting to do. And then they can also draw up the promissory note. So again, not on you to do. So it can be a very passive way. And really all it takes is just kind of some basic understanding of what that process looks like. So generally what happens is there's the very beginning is kind of called origination. Their borrower is going to reach out to you interested in having some sort of loan funded. And then at that point, you're doing the process, you're getting to know them, you're getting documentation, whatever you feel comfortable that you need to know about the borrower and the property. If everything checks out there, you ultimately end up at a closing table, virtual or otherwise, given what's going on with COVID. And then the funds are only transferred from the lender to the title company, and then the title company disperses them accordingly. So the one big thing that I want people to take away from private lending, especially as active investors, is never, ever, ever, you are never trading money with the lender before the closing. Because the biggest scam out there is active investors. They'll get someone on the line that claims to be a private lender. They'll say, oh, no problem. We can do this 100%, no problem. And all we need is like $5,000 to get your file opened and started. And then as soon as you send that money over, they disappear, shut down the email account, and they're on to, victim number 2. So those are 100% scams all the time. Never, ever, ever, as a borrower, send any money to a private lender outside of the closing table. So that is my main takeaway. If nobody learns anything else from this podcast, I've met so many active investors that have been scammed that way. And it gives private lending a bad name, because if I come forward to someone and say, hey, I'm also a private lender, and that's their experience, or they hear a colleague in the real estate investing world, that's their experience of private lending, it gives the whole arena a bad name when those people aren't even private lenders in the first place. They're just calling themselves that.
So, thanks. That's again, there's so much. I feel like every time I ask a question, I have more. What is kind of your understanding of the law? So can you do as many loans as you want? Do you have to loan from an LLC to LLC? Do you have to loan from person to an LLC? Can you kind of break that down a little bit? And again, we understand every state's a little different, but what is your experience there?
Yes, I mean, every state's going to be a little different. California and New York tend to be the kind of most complex or hardest states for lending. But generally, what you're going to want to do is have an LLC or some sort of business entity lending to another LLC or business entity, and it has to be for business purposes. So it can't be, somebody's going to go and do a cash out refinance on their investment property because they want to take a trip to Vegas. It has to be for business purposes. So there's two main criteria with most private lending is it can't be an owner occupied property because that puts it into a whole different realm of usury laws, disclosures, regulations that most private lenders as individuals are not going to want to be remotely involved in. So it must be a non-owner occupied property or investment property, as most people will call it. And it has to be something that it's basically what's called a business purpose loan. So it has to be, for some sort of purpose that is not personal. So they can't pull the cash out of their investment property to pay off credit card debt that is their own credit card debt. It has nothing to do with the business. So things like that. So it's called business purpose loans, even though it's for real estate. So that's kind of the two main, across the board. That's pretty much a convention in all 50 states that to stay on the safe side of that, you want to have those two things as a minimum, kind of documented. And then the thing that most people, if they have any sort of interaction with a hard money lender, most hard money lenders are going to ask that as the borrower, it's the LLC as the borrower instead of, Joe Smith, the borrower as an individual. And that goes back to a lot of the usury laws in many states kind of have these different buckets. So there's a bucket for, consumers that are getting, credit cards for themselves or home loans for themselves. There's a bucket for, different kind of, car loans, payday loans, all these other things. And the bucket that most lenders are trying to stay in is that business purpose bucket where it's me as an LLC lending to another LLC, for example. That's a business purpose loan, even though it might be on a residential family property, a house in a neighborhood, it's still considered a business purpose loan. And that's a completely separate bucket. And that tends to have the least amount of regulation, that tends to have the least amount of issues running into the usury. So they'll have the highest interest rates that could be charged, the highest fees that could be charged. So that's why you'll see a lot of that is they're trying to stay in that bucket, what that allows the most flexibility when it comes to the regulations and the usury laws.
Okay, cool. So let's say you're listening to the show and you say, okay, I've got 100 grand. How do you go about becoming a quote unquote private lender? And what's kind of your advice to someone listening to this?
So the kind of the curse and the benefit to private lending is the flexibility. So really, this is a business model that you can keep as small as you want or as big as you want, and it still be a viable business. Whereas, a lot of different aspects to real estate don't necessarily have that freedom, shall we say. So if it's someone that has $100,000 and they just want some extra mailbox money, they don't necessarily want to dive head deep into doing some underwriting, doing the processing, trying to find a borrower, something like that. They could do something as passive as find someone that will broker that money for them. And basically that broker will do all of the heavy lifting. They will find the borrower, they will underwrite the deal. So as long as you have some faith and you have some basic understanding of kind of what the deal looks like, are you going to be in the first lien position? Is this a second lien? Have some of those basic parameters, under your belt that you understand those things. It could be as easy as that, just brokering your money through another person. It could be all the way to the other extreme where you want to go set up an LLC and you want to learn how to do this. And, you want to find your borrowers and you want to have the real estate attorney draw up the documentation and all of that. So literally there's everything from A to Z. So when people ask me that question, how do you start? I really want to ask a question back. Well, what is your end goal? Because to me, being a chemistry professor, I'm always worried. I'm always thinking backwards. Most people call it thinking analytically. I want to think backwards. So I want to think about what the end goal is and then work my process backwards with the skills, resources, and knowledge I have at the time. So if someone has $100,000, they want to invest, passively in whatever distinction they consider passive. then that's usually my next question is, well, what's the end goal? Is this just something you want to try because you want an extra $1,000 a month? Or is this something that you potentially want to transition from being an active investor to a private lender or a passive investor at some point in the future? And this is your route to learn the ropes. Those are two very different tracks.
Okay, cool. So if you don't mind, let's kind of get into the nitty gritty here. So let's really dive deep. Let's say a standard deal. Let's say, excuse me. Let's say, again, you're loaning money. Let's say it's $100,000 to someone who's going to do a flip or something. Let's take an example, if you don't mind sharing one that you have. What is a standard interest rate you charge, after attorney's fees, after kind of everything's said and done? What could you typically plan to walk away with I know every deal is different, but you get what I'm driving at. Is a standard deal, what does it look like for someone who wants to get into private lending? What are you typically seeing right now?
I would say, depending on the market and the lien position and the experience of the borrower, annual interest rates are anywhere between about 8 and 14% on an annual basis. Origination points can be anywhere from 0 to 5. I've seen some extreme cases where it's 10, but that's kind of the general parameters. So I would say, a pretty average, short term, 12 months or less private loan is going to be probably about 12% annualized return. If you throw in, a couple origination points and you do something at like maybe 10% as a first lien position. If you're someone that, wants to do something called gap funding or second lien position, there are borrowers out there looking for gap funding. And that's where it really easily could be, you can kind of demand your price, obviously up to the usury levels of your area, because there's so few people doing gap funding, because you are in that second lien position. And obviously that's a riskier position. Should something go wrong with the first, by the time default charges and interest and everything else gets thrown in there, good chances you're going to be out that money that you put in for the second lien position, which is obviously, your interest rate you're charging is a direct reflection of the risk that's perceived in that loan. So the second mortgages are easily going to be starting at like 15% annualized all the way up to, I've seen 40% annualized.
Wow. That's, it is risky. Yeah. It has to be that return
Right.
for that. Okay. So then let's say, the next question I would ask is, let's say something goes wrong. You're in first position, you start the foreclosure process. What does that look like? Do you typically truly take over that property? Is it auction? What happens in a worst case scenario in this world?
That is going to vary greatly by state. So there's kind of two differentiations for states on a very broad level. There's what they call judicial foreclosure states and non-judicial foreclosure states. Judicial foreclosure states means the whole foreclosure process has to go through the court system. So potentially that could be a couple of years, especially if the borrower decides to move into the property and make it their primary residence, or they declare bankruptcy. There's all these things where it could potentially take a couple years to get title back to that property. There's other states where it's a deed of trust, for example, and the trustee is, some third-party entity. As soon as they default, that third-party entity then starts the foreclosure proceedings. And it could be as simple as a lot of paperwork that could take maybe a couple months. There's other states that allow something called a pocket deed. So basically, when the borrower goes to sign all the paperwork at closing, they will actually sign 2 deeds. They'll sign the one that takes over title for them, and then they'll sign another one that gives title to the lender, and that is kept in escrow at the title company or the closing attorney. So if they do default on the property, on the loan, that basically that secondary pocket deed will then be recorded, and then they have the transfer of title can be just like that. So it's really that particular aspect of private lending can vary greatly. And that's part of the reason why you will see private lenders, the big distinction between private lenders and hard money lenders, there's a lot, but when this particular category is they will generally lend in areas that are very close to either where they live or maybe a city or state that they know really well, like they used to live there, for example. And they don't tend to stray too far outside of that market because they know what the foreclosure process is. They know what the usury laws are. They know what the lending regulations are. Do they even need, some states require a mortgage broker's license to lend out your own money. It's one of those things. So it tends to be a very, closed system, very close to home type system. They're not going to be, I lend in a very specific market here in Virginia. There's lots of really great markets within 100 miles of me. One is in North Carolina, completely different state, and I don't lend down there. But theoretically, I could, because I've had potential borrowers ask me that. They're like, oh, well, I'm only 12 miles from where you are because I live right on the border. And I'm like, yeah, but that 12 miles crosses the state border. And there's a whole completely different set of lending laws. I'd have to get docs all drawn up for, specifically for your state. I haven't even looked to see what the foreclosure process is. So that's very, very, that part, especially for private lending, can be highly variable.
Okay, cool. So, I'm going to move to a little bit more selfish portion of the show because, the show focuses specifically on multifamily. I mean, we touch on single family stuff. I mean, this is really interesting. It's important. It's important to know kind of the other avenues. So that's why I'm excited to have you on the show. But the question I'm going to ask is, again, it's a little bit selfish, but it's, there is some private money out there for, let's say you're doing a syndication and you don't have the cash for earnest money or attorneys, they get very expensive very fast. So have you looked into that or do you know anything about that type of lending?
Yes. And I've done that in the past for kind of some smaller commercial multifamily deals. It's not something I would consider traditional private lending. So when I say private lending, I'm using private lending in the capacity that someone is securitizing that money against some asset. When you are doing earnest money deposit or EMD lending, you are essentially just lending someone unsecured capital, whether they're personally guaranteeing it, whether you're just lending it to their business, whatever the case happens to be. If the deal doesn't close, chances are you aren't getting that capital because like you mentioned, just to put in a Fannie Freddie loan application usually runs about 10 grand. Then if you're doing a syndication, the attorney's costs could be anywhere I've heard from about 13,000 to about 25,000 on the high side to kind of do all the Reg D, documentation. If you are paying for third-party services for due diligence, doing the walkthroughs, the physical inspections, all of that could very easily run into the tens of thousands, maybe even $100,000 if it's a big complex. So there's some significant costs up front that the money goes straight out the door, to a vendor. Whether that's going to be the title company, the loan company, the due diligence, whatever that happens to be. So that's a little bit different than just straight private lending. It is 100% a way of lending. And I do know people that do that. I have done that personally. But it's just a completely different way of looking at a deal, underwriting a deal. But it can be, again, kind of one of those win-win situations because you're allowing an operator to potentially take down more deals than they could on their own if they're using just their own capital. And then potentially you are either, there's kind of two ways to run that. So the private lender could essentially get the capital back once the deal closes from the funds that are raised through the syndication. And then, they get their interest just like it's a regular, almost like a business loan. Or they could say, okay, if you leave the capital in there, depending on how much it is, if you leave the capital in there, that obviously reduces the amount they have to raise. And so you could potentially be either on the LP side or the GP side, depending on what everybody's kind of preference and how the deal shakes out. So it can be a way for people that have some capital that want to get involved on potentially that GP team to be involved on that GP team. That's what they're bringing to the table is literal assets as their asset to the team. But again, it's really not, I wouldn't say it's for the faint of heart. You really need to know the operators. You really need to have your mind wrapped around the deal. How likely is this to close? Does it meet their business model? That sort of thing.
Okay, cool. I mean, thanks I really hope I'm not in that position. I think, it's important for listeners to hear though, I think is these deals are incredibly expensive to put together. And so there's kind of this tendency to think is like, oh, so you're you're using other people's money to make money. I mean, that's like the kind of negative view of like a syndicated deal. It's funny because there's two mindset shifts. One is, well, no, it's an opportunity, right? So it's like, there's people out there with money right now. And if you can provide an opportunity that's a pretty safe and secure and good business plan that should make money, it's not like I'm using someone else's money and putting together a team to buy a complex, right? So that's mindset shift one. And then two is, it takes a ton of capital, a ton of time, energy, experience, all that stuff to put these together. So I'm kind of, again, as selfish, I'm bringing it back to my listeners is like, this is all absolutely true. And, if someone out there has to borrow money to get it done, good for them. Maybe I'll be there one day. Maybe I'll have to, I find a good deal and one other's cooking and all my capital's gone, who knows, but it kind of leads me into my next thing. The question for you is, because you were talking about underwriting, let's say it's a little bit more standard deal, maybe a fix and flip that you're helping fund. How do you underwrite a deal? I mean, how do you know that a deal will work? How do you, what do you look for in that type of thing before you lend out your money?
So similar to what your investors, your audience is going to hear, from the syndication side, where it's all about the operators. I walk that same line when you're talking about single family, private lending, because I don't care how great the deal is. I don't care if they're buying it for 60 cents on the dollar and it needs zero rehab and all they need to do is sign an MLS contract to get it up on the market and sold. If they are not a good operator, they make poor decisions. They don't make them in a timely fashion. They're not trustworthy. They don't have integrity. They're not going to be my borrower. They're not going to be someone I want to work with, because the absolute worst person can nosedive a deal, the best deal, in a flash, just because from poor decision making. So for me, it really is going to start with kind of a unofficial glimpse into the borrower. So for example, this tends to be more relationship based. So it's not going to be, just, hey, fill out this application on my website and I'll get back to you. That's generally not, the route most private lenders are going to take. It's going to be a warm introduction from somebody else in the community that knows me. It's going to be an email introduction, whatever it happens to be. And then the first thing I'm going to personally go and do is I'm going to Facebook stalk you. So I'm going to friend
on my Facebook.
I'm going to friend request you, and then I'm going to Facebook stalk you, and I'm going to scroll through. And if I see a bunch of photos of somebody, flashing cash or standing in front of an Italian sports car they rented for the day to drive on some track or whatever, like, not to say those are bad people, but those are not my borrower, because I invest with people like everyone else that I know, like, and trust. And I don't like those things, and I don't trust those things, and I don't know those things. So that's not something I want to be involved in. Whereas if I go and scroll through your social media, for example, and I see a bunch of things about, past deals you've done or families that you've helped, or, pictures of the dogs, pictures of the kids, like you're a normal, quote unquote, normal, individual, that gives me a little more warm and fuzzy. Is that the only qualification I do? No, but that eliminates a lot of people very quickly. So that's why I advocate to everybody, either keep your social media on lockdown or make another profile that is just for real estate. One of the two.
That's good advice.
Yeah. But then after that, we talk, we kind of get a feel for each other. Do we have kind of the same goals? Do we have the same timeline? A lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about what private lending is, and they think we're a bank, and they're like, oh, I don't qualify for a traditional mortgage, so I'll go get, private money and I'll be fine. I'll just use that. Well, a lot of private money, you measure in the scope of months, not years. And they're looking to buy their first, long-term rental with private money. And it's like, okay, well, that's great, but you're only going to have the capital for like 6 to 9 months, max. And then you're going to have to qualify for that bank financing that you currently can't qualify for. And that's a problem for me as a lender, because that's how I'm getting paid in your business model. So you start having those conversations and get a feel for their experience. What have they done? And then if we think everything's kind of a go from there, what I do that's kind of unique is I ask for professional references. I ask for 3. I will then reach out to those professional references. And these have to be someone that you have done business with in some capacity in real estate. So I'm going to, it doesn't matter if it's a past partner, broker, whatever. just somebody that knows your kind of experience, your background with real estate. And then, of course, obviously, they're going to pick the people that are going to give them some glowing recommendations. So I talk to these people, and then I ask those people for recommendations from other people that might know my potential borrower. And I call that my secondary ring. And that secondary ring is where you tend to get a lot of really good information, because that's going to be where, oh, so-and-so got jilted, that secondary ring will be like, oh yeah, I did a deal with them like 3 years ago. They didn't help with any of the rehab costs. They left me to pay the mortgage payment all on my own. We nearly foreclosed on the place. Like, no, I would not do another deal with these people. So that secondary ring, in my experience, tends to be where you're just going to get a lot of the information that you want to know as a lender. And then the other kind of nice thing about real estate, when you're talking about lending in real estate, is there is a literal paper trail that cannot be, made fraudulent, because it's all public record. So if you have someone that comes to you and says, oh yeah, I've done like 5 fix and flips in the last 12 months. Okay, great. What's their addresses, what county, what city are they in? And then in those municipalities and public records, you can see when they took the deed over, when they transferred the deed. If it was a fix and flip, for example, you can see the mortgage that they took out. Was there satisfaction recorded? All these fun little details about the property, you could get from public records, because they might be able to go and say, yeah, I was a partner on, 5 different deals. But then when you pull up the information, it's like, well, your name's nowhere on title. Oh yeah, I wasn't on title. I was the contractor for him, so I wasn't on title. Well, that's not you doing a fix and flip. Like, that's just you showing up for work and being the contractor. That's 2 very different things in my mind. So you can really suss out a lot from those kind of 3 things. I would say Facebook stalking, doing the professional reference check, and then public records.
Yeah, thanks again. That's cool that you're really opening up about kind of your process. What I really want to touch on here, though, is what you first said is like the integrity of the person and the business plan, because you're right. Like, some properties can look great on paper, and the operator doesn't make timely decisions, like you said, is maybe, just doesn't make bad decisions. Right. And the other thing is integrity. It's like, maybe they just have the wrong intentions in mind, and that could tank a deal completely. Right. If they're just they don't care. So I think that was the piece that I took early on, was it draws a lot of similarities for passive investment. And that's kind of why I want to bring it full circle is, if you're going to invest in a deal with a syndicator, like let's say someone's going to invest one of my deals, I certainly hope they trust me. I hope they know that that's the goal, is integrity is the number one. Is, we would rather the deal go smoothly and get paid a little less, or we'd rather the property be a better place to live, make slightly less money. That type of thing, I hope in the long run, is why people are investing with us. And it sounds like you're kind of the same way. It's like, I would rather loan to someone who has high integrity, good skills in this industry. And so that's really cool. And it's such a connection between our 2 worlds. So I'm going to ask a little bit of a tough question for you. Have you had a bad experience? Like, have you had to foreclose? Have you, had to call the loan due, whatever it is, have you had a bad experience yet?
I have not had a bad experience to that degree. I have had some borrowers that did not get the capital back in the agreed upon fashion, just because it wasn't necessarily anything they did. It was just COVID caused, shortages of materials. I had one borrower that literally ordered windows the day he closed, and then 4 months later, he was still waiting for windows. And, he put it up on the market on MLS, and the only thing holding up closing was the installation of these windows. So he went over his time, but again, he kept me in the loop. We talked weekly. He gave me updates. He let me know. He even showed me the receipt. He's like, I literally ordered windows the day I closed because I knew this was going to be a problem. And, I had another borrower that ran over because his retail buyers, he actually had 2 retail buyers in a row not qualify. So they got, 15, 20, 30 days into escrow, and then two borrowers in a row ended up not being able to close. So it, went back on the market, got under contract, went back on the market, got under contract. So it really just came up again. He kept me in the loop. He let me know, hey, the first borrower went through they didn't qualify. So we're going to put it back on the market. It went back under contract very quickly, given the state of the market, the way it is right now. And then about a month later, we found out that borrower didn't qualify. So it got put back on the market, So, I don't want to say I'm necessarily forgiving, but I understand. There's some things that are just frankly out of everyone's control. I can't make windows show up faster. The borrower can't make windows show up faster. I can't make those borrowers qualify to buy that house any faster than anybody else can. That's kind of the nice thing about private lending. And I would say even to the same extent, passive investing and syndication is your goals tend to be aligned with the active investor. Like my job is not to basically bilk someone for as much capital, as I can get, the highest interest rates, the highest points that I can charge, because I don't want to put a bar up so high that they can't get over it and successfully complete the deal. And that's similar to what you see in the syndication space, because I see, because I also invest in syndications and I talk to a lot of people about passive investing. And, I'll see passive investors will say, oh, which deal should I take? Here's the 3 numbers on this deal, and here's the 3 numbers on that deal. And the only 3 numbers they're looking at is cash on cash, IRR, and their equity multiple. And I'm like, do you realize those numbers are fake, right? And they're like, what? And I was like, 100% fake. Not saying they're fraudulent. I'm just saying they're fake. They're projections. So do you understand the underwriting that came from those 3 numbers? Do you know the people that came up with those numbers? Do you know anything about the property itself? You can't just shop on those 3 numbers, it might sound great and rosy, but they don't understand that there's no legal obligation for an operator to hit those numbers. The SEC is not going to come back and say, oh, you didn't get the 17% IRR you promised these investors, you're in trouble. They don't care. And I don't think a lot of passive investors realize that. So it's really about you going back to that integrity component you were talking about. It's really about having the integrity as an operator to say, these are the numbers I think I can do with conservative underwriting, barring some world calamity like a global pandemic. This is the numbers we're looking to hit. This is the underwriting. This is how we got to these assumptions. And that's literally all those numbers are, is assumptions. And I wish more people understood that in the underwriting process.
Oh yeah, I mean that's such a good point. So I think if I were to invest passively in a deal, number 1 is the person, the operator. Mm-hmm. Number 2 is transparency. Can I ask you that question of where this came from in your model and have a clear picture and understanding? And then, there are times when you can overpromise and get busted by the SEC. So, I got to make that clarification. But You're right. If you're clear and you have the disclaimer, these are projections and you don't hit them, it's a risk, So that's that's what you need to understand as a passive investor is you're risking capital. That this isn't just like a CD, right? Where it has a 2% return. It's here's what we project. Here's what we think would happen. We're underwriting conservatively. There's a likelihood it could do even better. There's a likelihood it could do worse. And you need to understand that. So that's such a good tip for a passive investor. So the final question I want to ask here is kind of ties into that sounds like you've done both. Investing passively, let's say in a syndication, just to tie it back to the show, versus private lending. I understand that there's so many different avenues. That's one thing that's very, very cool about real estate. Like for me, I want to be on the GP side. I want to be actively involved. I want to have an intimate relationship with our property manager. I want to walk that property, and some people that sounds miserable. Then you can be a passive investor, right? So you could just invest and it's truly passive. And it sounds like you kind of enjoy the private lending side. I mean, it sounds like from your voice, the way you talk, it sounds like you enjoy it. Can you kind of describe that? Let's just say, what are the pros and cons or differences between those 2 avenues? Let's just say passive investing versus private lending.
The main difference, the reason we started doing both was as a private lender, unless you're also JVing on these deals, you're strictly on the debt side of the equation. So you're not getting any of those, say, tax benefits, for example, that, being the actual owner of the rental, being the actual owner of the property that you get because you're on the equity side of the equation. So we actually do both because we enjoy the tax write-offs of being in a syndication or something like that in a larger project. But I don't want to be actively involved. Like all the wonderful things you mentioned, no, I don't want to do any of those things.
Yeah.
Because my personal mantra is I invest passively so I can live actively. It's not that I want to kick back and sit on a beach in Tahiti and do nothing. It's just I want to spend my time doing things that I want to do and doing due diligence on a property and walking around and talking to the property managers and having weekly asset management meetings. Not in my wheelhouse, not how I want to spend my time. So there's lots of other things I would much rather be doing. To your point, it's really boils down to kind of what's your personality and what are your goals. And passive investing, by its name, tends to be a lot more hands-off. I choose to talk to my borrowers weekly or sometimes daily, but not all private lenders are like that. They're like, no, just mail me the check every month. Just let me know when where I have to send a payoff letter to. I don't need to know all the details. So it can really be as active or as passive as you want it to be. But when you're investing in syndication, realistically, you have to do nothing. You don't even have to open the emails, So it's really just a matter of like at that point for passive investing, as long as you have some basic understanding of multifamily or industrial or retail or hospitality, whatever the syndication is for, as long as you have some basic understanding of that, you have some faith in the operators, there's really not a lot to really kind of underwrite really and worry about. Whereas when you're doing private lending, like I mentioned, there's all those little nuances of, title and hazard insurance and all of that. And that tends to fall into the realm of the operator in the syndication space. So that's from other than the tax differences, that tends to be the other major difference between private lending and passive investing in something like a syndication.
Yeah, no, that's kind of what it sounds like to me too. I appreciate you kind of confirming that. I mean, this has been cool just to hear a different realm of investing. So this podcast, and I warned you in the pre-show, I mean, when you sign up and when we talked online, you understood, but I like to fire a list of questions because this podcast is also focused on mindset. And so I have this kind of belief where it's like, to be successful first, your mind needs to be kind of in the right place. And so I really love this portion of the show. So if you're ready, I'm just going to fire a list of questions for you.
Hey, let's go.
All right. So the first one is, do you have a morning routine?
I do. And it revolves around my dogs. Not really mindset, but, I usually spend about an hour in the morning kind of getting them. I have 5, getting them all up, and they're all on different diets and meds and the whole 9 yards. But then I lock everyone up and then I go sit on my back porch and I usually spend 20, 30 minutes. I have a Panda planner. I have a little journal book, and then I just kind of sit down and kind of plan out my day. Here's when I have a meeting for this. Here's what I got to do. I got to run over to this property, whatever it happens to be. And then I kind of sit down and just kind of journal whatever happens to be on my mind that day. Cause I'm one of those people, like it's just constantly going, like to the degree I have a problem sleeping because it's just constantly thinking about something. So I'll usually sit down in the morning for, 20, 30 minutes in the morning. I don't drink coffee. I have chocolate milk. So I sit there with my chocolate milk in my mug and just kind of sit and write and plan out my day. So that's usually what happens almost every morning.
Awesome. Oh, I love it. Okay. Next one is, what books are you reading, or what books can you recommend to our listeners?
Oh, that's such a great question. So the book I think that I've been most jazzed about recently is Who Not How by Dan Sullivan. I mean, I listened to the audiobook versus reading it on a car trip actually earlier this week. And the audiobook actually has insert, from Dan Sullivan himself. So you're hearing kind of his own thoughts about this topic, because the book was actually written by somebody else in collaboration with Dan Sullivan. But just so many great things to think about, just the shift in mindset that comes from that book, The Who Not How. My all-time favorite book, especially if you're talking about mindset, it's an oldie but goodie, and to me it's kind of the grandfather of this whole mindset movement, is a book called Psycho-Cybernetics by Dr. Maxwell Maltz. And he was actually a plastic surgeon that noticed these very different things by people's mindset. So For example, he had a champion fencer that came into his practice and had a big scar on his face from, having some fencing competition. And he was very, very proud of that scar. But then he had another gentleman, roughly the same age, same, ethnicity, everything else, with a very similar scar across his face. And this guy basically assumed he was Quasimodo. Like, he didn't go out, he didn't have a job, he wasn't married, didn't have kids. And that kind of sparked the idea that, wait a minute, this same thing, this same scar in two people that are relatively similar means two totally different things. And those two totally different things sent their life on completely different trajectories. This one guy saw himself as a champion, and this other guy saw himself as Quasimodo. So I highly recommend it's dated, the verbiage, the language, everything, and the kind of some of the baseline ideas, because it was written in the 60s, but it's still very, very applicable to today because of how much your self-image and your mindset puts you on a completely different trajectory in life.
Wow. That's okay. First of all, two very good recommendations. I think you're like the third of the last 5 guests who have recommended Who Not How. I just downloaded it yesterday. So I'm so excited to listen to that. And then the second one, there's so much to take from there. I haven't heard of that book. I wrote it down. I want to check it out, but it's actually a tip that could just be used in general. It's kind of your view of your situation is incredibly powerful. And even it could be something that someone else might look at as a blessing, even. Not necessarily this exact thing, but you get what I'm saying. So that's kind of a cool mindset tip in itself. Cool. The next one is, do you have a coach, or have you had a mentor or coach in the past? And if you did, was it worth it?
I didn't have a mentor or a coach, but I did join a mastermind program. And looking back, I've been in it for almost a year now. And I have my days, I'm not going to lie. I have my days where I'm like, this is stupid. And then I have other days where I'm like, this is awesome. And then obviously everything in between. But I would say the biggest takeaway from being in a mastermind versus just having a kind of a personal coach is, for me, it wasn't necessarily, I'm pretty disciplined, I'm pretty self-responsible. So I didn't necessarily need kind of the accountability component of a coach like many people will reach out to a coach for. What I really needed was, I needed community, because as a military spouse who's moved 19 times, not that I don't have friends, but a lot of times my friends are not like, hey, come on over for dinner tonight because you're 3 time zones away. That's not going to happen. So I needed community, which is why I chose to join a mastermind as opposed to get a personal coach. And the best thing that I never saw coming about the mastermind in seeking out community was that, you are going to be a reflection. I thoroughly hate this saying, but the saying of like your net worth is a reflection of your network. And to a certain degree, that's true, but I think it's more true in mindset. Because if you are surrounded by people that are doing quote unquote big things, whatever your big thing is, it could be write a book, it could be close on 200 unit apartment buildings, it could be, buying boutique hotels, whatever your big thing is, if you're surrounded by other people that are doing those big things, it then becomes normal. Like, that's the baseline for your group, is closing on a 200 unit apartment complex. And that really also kind of goes back to the mindset, because you're surrounded by these people, you're hearing their conversations. Even if you're not necessarily learning anything about multifamily, for example, you're still hearing the way they analyze things, the way they handle life, the way they handle their time, the way they interact with other human beings is still valuable information.
Oh yeah. I can't agree with you more. I'm a part of 3 masterminds. I'm kind of busy in that space, and I have a coach because I believe so strongly in what you just said. And I love that you hate that saying, because I hate it too. I hate when people say your net worth is your network. That it drives me nuts, because it's not a money thing maybe it is for others, right? But for me, it's not about money. It's about being surrounded by people who have a similar path, maybe similar goals as you. And exactly like you said, it becomes normal. The other thing I like about it is, within those masterminds, I tend to seek out the people who are 5 years ahead of me and talk to them. And the response I tend to get is, yeah, it's work, but guess what? You can do it. I did it, And so what you just said was so good. And then one other thing is, and actually what I was going to say was, it draws back to another book, is a book called Atomic Habits.
Love it.
And it's in there, about halfway through, he talks about that exact thing. Is like, surround yourself with people who are doing stuff like you want to do, and it becomes normal. And so it's not
Well,
this like crazy thought anymore, or you're not.
The other thing I say about masterminds that I think you don't necessarily get in the coaching space is a lot of people reach out to coaches because like they're the guru in whatever market or whatever thing they're trying to accomplish. And in the mastermind group, like you said, you have those various degrees of experience because wherever you are in the journey, you can still learn something from someone who's 1 or 2 steps ahead of you. You don't necessarily need to learn from someone who's done it for 20 years if you're only in your 2nd year of doing this. Someone who has been doing it for 5 years can still teach you stuff that's been doing it for 2 years. So I think in that when you're getting that mastermind kind of community, you're getting multiple different perspectives from various experience levels. So where the 20-year-old experience might tell you something completely different than the 5-year experience person would.
Oh yeah. Great tip. I love that. Cool. So the next question would be, what's something that you've done in the past that you wouldn't repeat that our listeners can take away?
I will never, ever, ever again have a long-term rental. Never. Never. Again, going back to kind of the mindset, a lot of the new investors, if they want to be quote unquote real estate investors, it tends to be you're going to be fix and flip or you're going to be buy and hold. That's the only 2 options presented to you traditionally as a new investor. And especially now with the, boot camps and masterminds and weekend getaways, if you sign up for a boot camp on how to be a BRRRR investor, for example, you show up at the Marriott on the weekend, no one's there is going to talk you out of being a BRRRR investor. They're just there to download as much information into you for $19.95 a month, kind of thing. They're not going to sit down and have a conversation with you. Does this style of investing suit your goals, suit your needs, suit your personality, suit your capital requirements, your time commitments? Nobody's having that conversation. So again, when we were new to real estate investing, we did the same thing. We're like, okay, we want the quote unquote passive income from being a landlord. And nobody tells you being a landlord's not all that passive until you've been there. And, we decided we wanted that passive income of being a landlord, and we bought some rental property, and the Navy stepped in and moved us thousands of miles away from said rental property. And even though we had a property manager, anything major that went wrong, we had to be involved. So we had to line up roofers, we had to line up contractors, we had to line up, tilers, whatever the problem was, because that particular property management company didn't provide that service. And we didn't know that, until something went wrong. And it was a very kind of adversarial relationship. And this is way back before COVID. You think about COVID now, it's the kind of the rhetoric that's out there is these rich landlords are kicking out these poor working people, and the eviction moratorium is the only thing from keeping people from being, millions from being homeless because the rich landlords are just money grubbing greedy, and it's like, okay, well, no, but that's not the way it is at all. But, it is kind of set up to not necessarily be a cohesive team, because obviously the owner of the property, the landlord, wants to get paid as much as they can for as little expense as possible. And then the renter wants to live in the Taj Mahal and pay $10 a month for it. So that automatically sets up 2 parties that do not have the same goals, do not have the same, alignment there. And it just doesn't get any better from there. And again, I think that's one of those things you realize only after you've been through it or talked to someone that said, no, I didn't like being a landlord, and here's, the real reason why I didn't like being a landlord. Not to say it's a bad way to invest. It's a great way to invest. It just didn't suit our skills. It didn't suit our time. It didn't suit who we were as a person.
Well, no, I appreciate you being honest there. I think a couple of takeaways for me would be, first of all, set the goal and talk with your spouse, or if you have one, or have an intention about what is your goal, what is your personality type, and then talk to people who have done it and say, what's it like? And then the second takeaway is your team is so valuable. So my wife and I, for example, we bought a single family, 4 years ago, out of state. It had somewhat of a similar experience where our property manager didn't do a great job. And, I am the type of person to give a benefit of a doubt. So I probably kept her too long. Eventually I had to change property managers, and it was like a flip of a switch. It went from being pretty miserable to being amazing. We still own that single family today. And I never think about it because my manager is amazing. So I think the 2 takeaways would be know who you are, know the style first, ask some people for honest feedback. If you go to a Marriott weekend and then you go buy a property in Dallas or whatever, it might be different than that painted picture, but find someone who's done it, and this kind of, I want to remind me to come back to your Facebook group, because that's similar to the Mastermind thing. So we'll come back to that, but let's finish these questions first. The next question is, what mindset tips can you give someone to kind of propel them forward?
You must absolutely positively have an abundance mindset. There's another great book, Carolyn Dweck wrote it, and it talks about abundance mindset versus a scarcity mindset, and having that abundance mindset. Because I feel like, especially right now, the way the market is, there's a lot of new investors that are, both in the multifamily space and the single family space. They're just so desperate for a deal. They're like, I got to get a deal. I did this weekend boot camp. They promised I'd buy an apartment complex in 30 days. I got to find something. And they're paying extremely low cap rates for stuff that realistically on a per unit basis just doesn't make sense. It's not even anywhere near the 1% rule, for example. Just because they want a deal, because they think they're going to miss out. They're going to miss on this golden opportunity to buy this multifamily, whatever it happens to be, and they're overpaying, but they're coming from a place of a scarcity mindset, or they want to take down the deal themselves, or they want to take down the deal with as few other GPs as possible, even though all of them are brand new and we're all in that Marriott weekend, learn how to buy an apartment complex in 30 days. They are going to do it because they want to keep all the money for themselves. And I think that's very much in real estate, especially, that's the wrong way to go about life. The multifamily space is a very small little world. So if you are the type of person that's open and engaging and collaborative, and you have that abundance mindset, you're going to go much farther, because it is such a small little space. Everybody in multifamily knows just about everybody else in multifamily. So if you kind of get that reputation of being someone that's going to, be of that scarcity mindset, you're not going to get very far.
Yeah, that's such a good tip. I completely agree. I think like, for example, my partner and I, for the last year, we've been traveling to the market and finding that exact thing. There's groups even out, there's even quote unquote gurus coaching to buy a low cap rate right now. And what's happened is it's become really, really hyper competitive, but I completely agree. There's enough, and there will be enough, and there's enough share to go around, to partner on the deal, that if the GP split is smaller, meaning you're owning a smaller portion of the deal, that is absolutely okay, because there'll be 10 more behind it, and so I really love that tip. I'm a huge proponent in skipping the scarcity mindset. I mean, just in general, but bringing it back to real estate, it's a good example. So this one's to me, the hardest one is what is your definition of success?
That I get to do what I want when I want. Because I know a lot of people, they'll say, oh, I want financial freedom, or I want financial independence. And it's like, okay, that's great. But then what are you going to do after that? Again, I'm not going to go sit on a beach in Tahiti and do nothing. Like, I'm going to be actively involved. I'm in something. So it's basically the freedom to be actively involved in something. And it also, I don't end up in a situation where I'm delaying gratification. I'll be happy when I no longer have to do these fix and flips, and in 10 years, I'll have enough capital where I can be financially independent. Well, I'm sorry to break the news to you, but this whole thing is about the journey, not the destination. It's going to take you probably 100 times longer on the journey than it is for you to have that single point in time where you're like, yes, I'm financially independent. You might be 75 by the time that happens. So it's really about, enjoying the journey you're on, and being able to kind of realize that what you're truly after isn't necessarily financially independence. For me, it's very much about geographical independence, because I want to keep my family together. So wherever the Navy moves us, as long as we have electricity and internet, I can go and I can continue my business and do what I do. And it's also time freedom, because I want to be able to go and spend time with my family and my friends that I don't happen to live in the same time zone, much less state, as most of them. So it's really about that.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah. I think that's what I describe as like, have the why, have the reason why you're doing what you're doing. And then the tip that you said about enjoying the journey is so powerful. That's such a good one. People don't talk about enough, because like, I'm searching for financial freedom, but another kind of thing to break to people is I don't know of anyone who's ever been like, okay, I have enough. I'm going to quit.
Yeah.
Or, okay, I am sitting on this beach. And if they do, they'll probably find themselves a little bored, I'd imagine. So I love those two tips. Like, enjoy the journey and start with the why. What's the goal here? So that's good stuff. So I will circle back. I know you started a Facebook group. Can you tell our listeners about that and how do they get involved there?
Yes. So I started a group that was basically for education and networking around private lending and passive investing. We do have a lot of educational talks for specifically geared towards passive investors, because a lot of education doesn't happen when people show up to see these like pitch decks for syndications, because they're trying to get so much information kind of across to a group of passive investors in 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes, that there's no real way to kind of dive into the mechanics of what makes, this deal a good deal or a bad deal. They're going to show you everything that's great. And so we do a lot of education and networking centered around specifically private lending and passive investing. The group is called Private Lending Lessons. We have daily discussions. We have weekly educational events. We have monthly networking events. So you can actually like, quote unquote, get into the room with other private lenders or other people that are doing private lending and, run ideas past them, ask questions. What do you do for this? What do you do for that? And there's an open forum within the group too, where you could just post a question and say, hey, someone approached me about this deal. I don't really know how to underwrite this specific component of it, or I don't know where to start, or, whatever the question is. It's really a community of people that very much, I make sure that they have some level of an abundance mindset. Because I've been asked, like, what if I teach all these other people how to do private lending, doesn't that put me out of business? And no, it doesn't. That's basically what I'm doing, is taking capital from Wall Street and bringing it back to Main Street. Because if there's some family out there that could take a HELOC out on their house, for example, and pay 4% to do that, and then turn around and lend it out at 12, and they're collecting that extra 8% of capital that otherwise would have just been sitting there doing nothing, that could help pay for a kid's college education, car payment, whatever the use happens to be. And it's not going to hedge fund managers in Manhattan that are supplying these hard money lenders. So I'm 100% of the opinion that education and networking is two of the best things that you can do for your financial self.
Yeah. I mean, I say this basically every podcast, is education is key. I mean, that's one of the hearts behind the podcast, is to tell people about it. Get out there and check it out. Listen to as many podcasts you can. Get on Facebook groups. I'm not a huge fan of Facebook, if I'm being totally honest, but I love the groups. I really do. Like, I'm part of the groups, and that's where I head and that's where I go. And they're so powerful. So, Alex, thanks for putting that group together. If you're listening and you're interested in that, go check it out for sure. And the final thing I would ask is, how can people get in touch with you? How can they learn more about you?
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm just Alex Breshears on LinkedIn. So feel free to reach out, send me a message, send me a connection request. Obviously, you can find me in the group in Private Lending Lessons. So feel free, you can join the group. You'll see me, posting in there. Feel free to reach out. I genuinely enjoy talking to people, educating people about private lending and passive investing. I think it's just a wonderful vehicle that doesn't get spoken about enough, especially with new investors. So feel free to reach out and chat, and we'll see if I have any resources that I think could help you. I'm happy to connect anybody with those resources as well.
Awesome. Yeah, this has been a cool show. This is like a different avenue. So I'm so happy to have you on. I appreciate your time. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you. I had a great time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Real Estate Mindset Podcast. If you've enjoyed the content today, please follow this show wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to head over to wildoakcapital.com for more information or to connect with Eric directly. Please take a moment to leave a review or tell a friend about what you've listened to today. We hope you'll tune in again soon.